As many of you know, I am a December baby. Specifically, my birthday is on the 21st. So in addition to having to share the spotlight with Santa and Jesus every year, it also meant enduring the dreaded combination birthday-Christmas present. I actually saw a really funny cartoon that had one of the wise men explaining to Mary that his present was for both Jesus' birthday and for Christmas. So apparently that practice has a long history. Although, for the record, my parents were always incredibly good at separating the two, and Alyssa is amazing at it as well. But given the date of my birth, that meant that my mom, who is also a pastor, was pregnant with me during Advent. I think I've told this story before, so apologies if it's a repeat for some of you, but one of her favorite stories about that time was right before she was about to go out on maternity leave. I think it was like the third Sunday of Advent, and she was very pregnant. So much so that one of the members of the altar guild was trying to convince her to preach while sitting down instead of standing in the pulpit. They reached a compromise, and they got her a stool that she could lean against should she need to. But the thing that no one anticipated being a problem was my taste in music. You see, the special music piece that day was a very spirited song that had a really prominent kettle drum that I apparently just loved. I woke up and started kicking my little heart out, to the point where my mom began to wonder how she was going to preach a sermon with her body lurching every few seconds. Luckily, as soon as the music stopped, I went to sleep and allowed my mom to preach her sermon in peace. But I'm always reminded of that story when I hear the gospel reading for today about Mary's visit with Elizabeth. That story, as we just heard, picks up right after the angel Gabriel has visited Mary to tell her the big news. We're not told how much time has passed since that monumental announcement, nor are we told who all knows about it either. Mary may have told her parents about it, and maybe even Joseph by this point. We'll be hearing more about him next week, but that story comes from the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Luke purposefully makes these two women, Mary and Elizabeth, the focus of this version of the birth narrative. So there's no real way of knowing who all knows at this point, besides Mary, of course. She may not have told anyone else yet. What we do know is that Mary is on her way to visit her cousin Elizabeth. Now, this would have been a pretty substantial journey, at least 80 miles one direction. So this isn't your quick trip across town. Given what all had just happened, though, I'm sure that Mary really appreciated that time alone to think. Can you imagine what all must have been running through her head? All of the different feelings and emotions that she must have been experiencing. Was there a residual mix of fear, joy, and wonder left over from her encounter with the angel? Had doubts begun to creep their way in yet? Was she wrestling with how she was going to tell Joseph? Maybe that's why she was going on this long trip, to seek out Elizabeth's wisdom and guidance. But given the unique nature of the position Mary found herself in, how in the world is Elizabeth going to even begin to relate to her on something like that? Well, it's important for us to remember that Mary is not the only woman to experience a miraculous conception in the first chapter of Luke. Elizabeth was also pregnant with a baby whose name would be John, that the world would come to know as John the Baptist. Elizabeth was married to a priest named Zechariah, and Zechariah was visited by the same angel that had visited Mary. So the fact that Elizabeth was pregnant was equally amazing, but for a slightly different reason. Whereas Mary is a young, engaged, but not yet married virgin, Elizabeth was getting on in years. And those aren't my words, they're the words of her husband, which doesn't make it much better. But Scholars actually think that she was probably around 88 years old at the time. So you can imagine that Zechariah had a bit of a hard time believing what the angel had to say. He was so incredulous and amazed that he questioned the angel, just to make sure that he had heard everything correctly. And Gabriel responds to his questioning by saying, "Because you did not believe my words, you will become mute and unable to speak until the day of your son's birth." Now, I don't love that this is Gabriel's response, because rather than thinking about doubt and wrestling with disbelief as bad things that are worthy of punishment, I think that they are instead essential to a healthy and active life of faith. To doubt means that we actually care enough about our beliefs to wrestle with them, to sort through them and figure out what it is exactly that we hold to be true. The great theologian Frederick Buechner, who recently passed away, once said that doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving, which I just absolutely love, because it's so true. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is instead an integral part of faith. The opposite of faith really is apathy or disinterest. So, given that fact, I choose instead to believe that Gabriel rendering Zechariah mute and unable to speak was less of a punishment and more just the angel's version of an early baby shower present for Elizabeth. Given Zechariah's propensity for saying stupid stuff and all, a little peace and quiet before that baby came would have been right up Elizabeth's alley. That's all I'm saying. So that is the situation that Mary is heading towards. And as I said before, she must have been experiencing a whirlwind of different emotions: excitement, fear, wonder, joy, anxiety, and probably a decent amount of doubt. What if she had misunderstood the angel? Was there even an angel at all? Was she going crazy? What if she had just imagined the whole thing? And in addition to doubt, I can imagine that she was carrying a good deal of shame as well, or at least fear of the potential shame that this whole situation could bring about. You see, Mary lived at a time and in a culture where shame was a very real and very dangerous thing. The people of Israel, and especially the surrounding Roman culture, placed high value and importance on honor, both for a family as well as for an individual. And the events that had taken place had the potential to bring shame upon not only herself, but her whole family, and Joseph and his whole family as well. It could seriously damage all of their reputations and thus jeopardize their positions in the community. And community was essential. To be ostracized from the community would mean that they would no longer be allowed to attend worship, since worship was a communal act, which would mean that they were cut off from the primary expression of their faith. That's one of the reasons why Jesus prioritized those who had been pushed to the margins of society so much during the course of his ministry. So many of his healings were done so that a person could return to their family, their community, and subsequently to their life of faith. So even though we're talking about something wonderful here, the birth of Jesus, we can't forget that this put Mary in a very difficult and dangerous situation. Maybe that's why she went to such great lengths to go and see her cousin, because a secret like that would have been almost impossible to bear alone. And Lord knows she couldn't confide in anyone at home for fear of word getting out. Her silence would have been of the utmost importance if she and her family were to remain safe. And yet, she had to tell someone, because feelings like that don't just go away when you bottle them up or push them down. The famous sociologist and researcher Brené Brown says that if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs three things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. She continues, however, that if you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and you douse it with empathy, it cannot survive. And that is exactly what Elizabeth does for Mary. Mary scarcely has time to walk in the door and say hello before Elizabeth feels John leap for joy inside of her and loudly proclaims, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." So much for keeping things secret. Now everyone in a 5-block radius knows. Rather than confirm Mary's fears that this is something that should be kept secret and quiet, Elizabeth douses that petri dish of shame and fear that Mary has been cultivating with a huge dose of empathy, compassion, and love. In just a few words, she gives Mary everything that she needed and more. She's reassured that no, she isn't crazy, and that yes, angels do come and proclaim miraculous and unbelievable pregnancy announcements. She's reminded of her inherent worth as a person. Elizabeth doesn't just say, "Blessed is the fruit of your womb." She says, "Blessed are you among women." She showers Mary with the reassurance and positive affirmation that I'm sure she has been desperately needing. And most of all, suddenly, Mary is not alone anymore. There's someone with her who understands exactly what she is going through. Someone who has walked and is walking that same path that has been laid out before her. Pastor Laura and I recently wrapped up a 5-week book discussion group on grief, suffering, and hope. And it was a powerful experience, one that was filled with a great deal of sacred ground and vulnerable hearts sharing sacred stories. There were often tears, and there was even more often laughter, holy and divine laughter that comes when a person's spirit is freed. Because on the evening of our last class, when we were sharing all of our reflections, there was one sentiment that pretty much everyone agreed with, and that was how comforting it is to know that we are not alone in our grief, that there are other people who also struggle with pain and suffering and loss and the shame and sadness and confusion that accompany those things. You know, as humans, I think we sometimes run the risk of convincing ourselves that we are alone when we experience stuff like that. We look around and we see everyone else, and they all look so put together. You know, they all look like they know what they're doing, and they got it all figured out, and that life is going great for them. There's no way that they can feel the way I feel. There's no way that they know what it's like to feel broken or sad. I must be the only one, and therefore something must be wrong with me. And because we feel like they can't understand, we don't talk about those feelings. Instead, in our shame and in our fear, we keep them secret. And in that secrecy, they grow exponentially until, by the grace of God, our own versions of Elizabeth come along and tell us that we are not alone, that there is nothing wrong with us, that we are blessed and beloved and worthy of great joy and celebration. Immediately after Elizabeth's proclamation, Mary gives voice to her beautiful and powerful song known as the Magnificat. We will actually sing a version of her words as our sending hymn for today, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the version that appears in the Holden Evening Prayer. Her words are prophetic and proud and bold and brave and all manner of other wonderful things, and they are only possible after she is seen and known and loved. That's the beauty of relationship, of community, of being known and having the privilege to know one another. Now, That doesn't mean that the fears won't still creep into her head some nights as she lies awake in the quiet darkness. And it's very likely that others will still try and shame her and her family for something that they don't fully understand. But thanks to Elizabeth, she can rest assured because she knows that fear and shame are not the most powerful forces at work in her life. The most powerful force at work in her life is love. Love that comes from an exuberant and not so great at keeping secrets cousin named Elizabeth. Love that is divine in nature, that is taking on human form inside her womb in the person of Jesus. Love that we eagerly await and look forward to on Christmas Day, and love that we know is already present and actively at work in our lives here and now. Dear people of God, I hope that you can find your Elizabeth, that you can find your person in whom you can confide, or that you might get the blessing to be Elizabeth for someone else. Because I guarantee that whatever you are going through, you are not alone in that struggle. God has given us the gift of community to dispel our fears, to shrivel up our shame and turn our tears into laughter. And that is something that is worth celebrating and shouting aloud for every neighbor in a 5-block radius to hear. Amen.